Welcome everyone again. I will start with a little introduction to the mitigation project that is hosting this webinar series before I give the word to Sebastian and Marc-Olivier. Okay. Let's see. Here we are. Okay. Welcome everyone to Meet's Spring, 2023. And oh, that's not correct. Let's see. Oh no. Yeah. You are seeing my slides now, right? Yes. There's a jingle here that is played.
More meat, less meat. Meat. Teach you not to bite me. More meat, less meat.
Yes, a fancy intro with a big typo there indicating it's the start of the year. So I keep getting the year wrong.
More meat, less meat.
Okay. This is Sebastian Billows and Marc-Olivier Déplaude, and they will talk to us today about legal repair and how European legislation on pig welfare is domesticated in the context of French pig farming. A little bit about the project. The webinar series and this work is funded by Mitigation. It's a project that was funded by the Norwegian Research Council under a climate research call. This was quite unique because it's unlike several climate research projects from the so-called hard sciences, this project is a social sciences, humanities, and arts project, which is also a transdisciplinary project, including actors in farming, in the restaurant sector, in food provisioning and retail, and also climate communication and culture actors. Actually, we have an exhibition opening on the 15th of February in Trondheim at the Trondheim Art Museum with the title More Meat, Less Meat that you heard in the jingle. So if you want to find out more about that, please visit our site. The project itself is structured combining principled ethics and practice theory to explore 3 R's for sustainable meat use. And these 3 R's are recognizing animals and people who are involved in making meat, replacing, where possible, animal-based protein with plant-based or lower climate impact alternatives, and refining how we use animal-based meat to reduce waste and malnutrition, including obesity, and to match our wants, shall we say, and our consumption to our needs. If you are following this online and you want to tweet, or you can use this hashtag, and these are our Twitter and Facebook accounts in case you want to tag us. So I will stop sharing right now and say a little bit about Sebastian and Marc-Olivier's work before I give the word to them. Sebastian Billows is a sociologist. He is employed as a permanent researcher at INRAE, the French National Research Institution for Agriculture, Food and the Environment. And his research area is competition policy and the organization of agri-food chains. His current research project actually focuses on deregulating the European dairy sector, but in much of his work, he is interested in how legal norms are elaborated, interpreted, and reappropriated by market players. And this paper is done collaboratively with Marc-Olivier Déplaude, who is also employed at INRAE, and also sharing membership in the Institut de Recherche Interdisciplinaire en Sciences Sociales, a mixed research unit between INRAE and CNRS and Université Paris-Dauphine. Marc-Olivier is also working on the industrialization of agriculture and food, but from a political science and STS perspective. He studies the transformation of agri-food production systems, and he's interested in economic, scientific, technical, and political investments that go to support them. And so with this short introduction, I will give the word to Sebastian and Marc-Olivier. Thank you so much for starting us off in 2023.
Just a sec. There you go. Thank you, Sophia. Thank you so much for inviting us to this seminar. Thank you for your really nice introduction. Yeah, just to provide a bit of context on this research project. So it's basically Marc-Olivier who's been working for a long time on the pig farming, on pig farming in France. And I joined this research project because I have a background in law and society. So and in this case, law, the interpretation of law was really relevant. So we took up this small project together. We did some interviews together in Western France, where most of the pig farming is concentrated, and this is the outcome of this collaboration. So our starting point is the notion of repair. We borrow this notion from Christopher Henke, who uses it to describe the role of agricultural science in supporting the development of intensive agricultural systems. We're talking here both about agricultural scientists, so those who produce the innovations, the technical innovations that help intensive farming grow, but also the agricultural advisors who implement these techniques on the field with farmers. Now, according to Henke, this notion of repair is two-sided. First of all, there's a diffusion of productivity-enhancing techniques that fuels the rise of intensive farming systems. But on the other hand, these new productivity-enhancing techniques produce problems of their own, and this requires another layer of intervention from agricultural advisors to tackle these problems that result from the application of intensive methods. For instance, the fact that if you use one single type of crop, or if you increase the productivity of certain animals, it sometimes makes these more sensitive to diseases, and this creates problems that agricultural science needs to deal with. So these are the two big tasks that were already identified in the literature for agricultural scientists and agricultural advisors. And we'd like to add another challenge that we've identified another challenge. And this challenge comes from the growing criticism, the growing contestation that that exists over industrial farming systems. So there's growing disagreement over these industrial farming systems due to their negative externalities and the ethical issues they raise. And this leads public authorities to pass new regulations to take into account, to respond to those concerns. Now, these new regulations, they create a challenge for intensive farming systems, but also a challenge for agricultural advisors who work with them. First of all, these new regulations sometimes contradict what agricultural advisors previously advocated for. And second, these new regulations are likely to breach the bond of trust that exists between farmers and agricultural advisors. So one thing that agricultural advisors have to do now is to maybe convince farmers to take up new standards, new techniques that might lower the income of farmers or make their working conditions harsher. So how do they handle that in their relationship with farmers? So in this paper, we'd argue that agricultural advisors are very much aware of these stakes. These new challenges, these new regulatory challenges, led agricultural advisors to redefine their professional role to a certain extent. And this leads us to reconceptualize repair, to include these legal and regulatory issues. So, and we try to go further than Henke and Gutmann, Christopher Henke, who's already identified the role of, who's already mentioned the role of regulation in the work of agricultural advisors, but not in a very systematic way. So to be more systematic about the role of regulation and law, we bring in some concepts from the law and society tradition. The first concept we bring in is the concept of legal endogeneity. So it's the idea that the interpretation of legislation takes place beyond political and legal arenas. There are out there legal intermediaries who are not trained formally in law, but who craft local interpretations at the local organizational level. And through a process of institutionalization, these local interpretations add up, they become standardized, and they become legitimate forms of compliance that end up being recognized by state authorities and courts as the correct way to comply with the law. So what we argue is that agricultural advisors become legal intermediaries. They interpret the law, and in doing so, they put their professional skills in the process. They use their expertise, their technical expertise, to interpret the law. So this knowledge that agricultural scientists and agricultural advisors have plays out at different levels. It plays out in formal scientific activities that are undertaken in labs, but also in the design of new technical devices and in the day-to-day prescription work done with farmers. To illustrate and to describe the scope of this new work of legal repair performed by agricultural scientists and agricultural advisors, we looked at the European Union. So the European Union had for a long time, since the emergence of the Common Agricultural Policy in the 1960s, the very productivist outlook on agriculture. But then starting from the 1970s, uh, there was a growing concern for animal welfare. And this issue became salient in the 1970s because at that time the UK joined the EU, and the UK was a pioneer on the issue of animal welfare. So there were social movements that protested against the negative effects of industrial animal farming systems on animal welfare, and this led the European Economic Community to pick up this issue and to legislate on this. And this led to a first directive to be passed in 1991. This animal welfare legislation concerns different types of farm animals, cattle, hens, and pigs, but we chose to focus on pigs. We chose pigs because it's a form of animal husbandry that over 10, 20 years shifted from something that farmers did on the side that was a bit artisanal, as we would say in French, and it shifted over 1 or 2 decades from this to a very industrial farming system. And we also chose to look at focus on one country, France. So this is mainly for practical purposes because we're interested on how the legislation is implemented at the farm level. So we cannot study. So we had to focus on one region. And also, it's important for our case to look at one country because we're talking about an EU directive. As opposed to EU regulations, directives set broad goals, and it's up to member states to come up with domestic legislation to achieve those goals. So you really need to include the national level if you want to understand how the law is made and implemented. So we divided this presentation in 2 sections. First, I will briefly talk about the outcome of the regulatory process. So we start with the end of the process, so to speak. And I'm going to show that the outcome of this process, the way it was implemented by French farmers, did not match the initial hopes of the legislators and of the social movements that were behind this legislation. And then Marc-Olivier will describe the 3 steps that were taken by the technical and scientific advisors working with the French pig sector that contributed to that outcome. So first outcome that we have to look at is the reduced scope of the regulation compared to what was initially hoped for. So this legislative process was kicked off in 1991 by a directive which had a very broad scope and basically said we European institutions should do something ambitious about animal welfare, and it requested it commissioned a scientific veterinary committee to write a report by 1997 about the welfare of pigs, looking for solutions to improve the welfare of pigs in general. At that time, there was hope among animal rights activists that new European standards would change key aspects of the industrial pig farming model. And a key aspect of this farming model is raising fattening pigs in cramped enclosed spaces on slatted floors. And these slatted floors, they're made of concrete or plastic, as you can see in this picture. And these slatted floors and the fact that you have a lot of fattening pigs in a small space, it raises a lot of questions from an animal welfare point of view. And there was a fear in the early 1990s among major players of the French pig industry that this practice of raising fattening pigs on slatted floors would be put into question by European legislation. In the end, however, in 2001, when two directives were passed, and this is the conclusion of this legislative cycle, the only constraints that were introduced concerned pregnant sows. And pregnant sows, they only represent 6% of the animals raised on the typical French pig farm. So these two directives that were passed in 2001, they introduced new constraints on how pregnant sows should be raised and actual constraints. As you can see on the left side of the slide, the dominant form of raising pregnant sows at that time was to lock them up in an individual crate, and it made it mandatory to raise them in groups. But it also gave farmers a 12-year grace period for compliance, and the deadline for complying was set in 2013. So yes, there were new constraints, but only on a specific type of animal on the pig farm, and with a very long grace period. Now, the second outcome that did not match the initial hopes of EU legislation was the way the 2001 directives were implemented by the French pig sector. In the 1990s, the push to raise sows in groups came from Northern European countries such as the UK, Denmark, or the Netherlands. And the farming sectors in those countries, they had developed a new housing system where you could raise up to 200 sows in the same space, which is the sketch you can see on the left. And the idea was to put a lot of sows together to favor interaction among them and to allow them to allocate specific spaces to specific functions. And this innovation relied on an electronic feeder system because you mix together groups that sows that have different sizes, different phases of the gestation process. So you need to allocate specific amounts of feed to each sow, and you do this via electronic tags and an electronic feeder system. Now, despite there being this ambitious technical device to comply with the 2001 directives, the French pig farmers went for other types of technical devices. In 2010, among those who complied with the 2001 directives, there were only 13% of French farmers who used the EFS-based system. The majority of them chose more cramped housing systems. The first one, which we see in the middle, which has a small pen housing typically 6 to 8 sows of similar size and with similar feed requirements. And the other one on the right is even more cramped, and it looks a lot like the previous system where sows were kept in individual crates, and the only addition was a tiny courtyard behind the crates and a door that could open for the sows to access this courtyard. So this is the outcome of the regulatory process, and as we can see, the end result, the way it was implemented in farms, was less ambitious than what the legislators hoped for. Now we're going to talk about the role of agricultural scientists and agricultural advisors in producing this outcome. And before Marc-Olivier tells us the different ways the agricultural advisors help the French pig farming sector interpret the law and implement it in the way we've just seen. I'm just going to present the major players in this field first. First of all, we have our employer, the National Institute for Agricultural Research, which ran different labs testing different ways of raising pigs. There's also the Pig Institute, which also ran experimental farms to test different technical systems. And then we have two types of institutions that work really closely with the farmers themselves: the Chambers of Agriculture, which provide applied expertise, although they also ran their own experimental farms. And a key actor here, the producer organizations. In the French pig sector, most pig farmers are members of producer organizations. So these organizations, they pull together farmers to market their meat, and they also provide technical services to the farmers. So these producer organizations, they hired technical advisors to help farmers modernize their operations. And these technical advisors, they really played a key role in as legal intermediaries, helping farmers comply with the 2001 directives. So now Marc-Olivier is going to show us 3 ways in which this group of agricultural advisors contributed to the domestication of EU animal welfare legislation.
Okay, thank you, Sébastien. So the first way of domesticating EU legislation on animal welfare was through scientific research that contributed to the scope to estimating the scope of this legislation. It began in the early 1990s. At this time, INRA and Pig Institute researchers realized the importance of animal welfare science in regulatory debates. And some key researchers working for the INRA and for other research organizations became involved in this academic field. And they commissioned, in particular, a large-scale study on the welfare of sows and comparing the existing housing systems at this time. And the result of this study were that no housing system was perfect. So they downplayed the need for regulation. And on a broader level, these researchers aimed at developing a new approach to animal behavior. And their point was to counter emotional approaches to animal welfare, what they called emotional researches, in order to establish objective criteria to measure whether animals were well kept. And they assumed that pigs were farm animals, and as such, they were part of a technical system, and they should not be compared with animals living in a natural environment. And this new kind of expertise was successfully used in regulatory circles to restrict the scope of legislation. First, at the European level, it helped the French pig lobby to obtain for farmers considerable time and leeway to change their sow housing systems, as Sébastien explained a few minutes ago. And at the French level, we found that this new form of animal welfare science was used to convince officials that the controversial courtyard system was consistent with the EU welfare directive. In particular, they succeeded in having the surface of truth included in the minimum surface per sow, which was not initially planned by the directive. And they also argued on the average size of the sows raised in Brittany to allow farmers to make smaller, even smaller courtyards. So by different ways, they restricted even once more the scope of legislation. So now I will say a few words about the second contribution made by agricultural advisors to domesticate EU legislation. once the directive was passed, the advisors of the French-speaking sector set out to find the most efficient group housing systems to comply with the directive. And they set up a task force of engineers and technicians to find the most efficient systems. And the work they made at this time is interesting because we find here the kind of work of prescription that is described in the STS literature on repair. And what you can see is that agricultural advisors refrained from prescribing a standard technical solution from above. Instead, the technical studies they did commissioned the studies used the typical French farm as a starting point. And I think this quote on the right is very, very telling. These engineers realized that the EFS system, which was a more ambitious, it is ambitious, but it was ambitious in a context of a not very ambitious legislation. So it is not so ambitious, in fact, but it was more ambitious than the other system that was adopted. So they realized that the EFS system, although it was more advanced in a technological way and superior in terms of animal welfare, they realized that the system was unpopular with farmers. For example, farmers complained about the lack of reliability of this feeding system, and they said that it required special skills they didn't have. So many of them were reassured by the courtyard system. And although it was more expensive, it needed more metal and more welding, it means that caring for sows could be done in a very similar way to the previous individual system. For example, in the case of the courtyard system, you could still lock up an animal if you needed. For example, a sick animal you needed to vaccinate, for example. So instead of imposing a new system to farmers, the advisors set out to optimize existing systems. So they performed a very fine work. They did a very fine work at different levels, at the national level, as we saw it, but also at the level of the individual farm. For example, they considered the layout of the existing farm, and they advised the farmers on what they should do in the case of the very specific aspects of our farm. And it meant that the new systems, the new equipments had to be both cheap and easy to manage. In the end, the interactions of technicians with farmers led them to make many small improvements to the equipment which were provided by manufacturers, such as the addition of reinforcement brackets for the system using partial barriers, which were often too fragile for heavy animals like sows. These technical details may seem minor, but it is the sum of these multiple repairs that allowed the agricultural advisors to become credible legal intermediaries in the eyes of the farmers. And as we'll see in the next slide, it was a crucial resource to convince the most reluctant farmers to comply. So, at first, the work of prescription toward farmers was, in an initial way, it was a technical work. The advisors tried to find the most efficient way to comply, given the existing technical and economic fragilities of French farms. But in 2008, so 5 years before the deadline for compliance, they felt that it was not enough. At this time, only 30% of pregnant sows were raised in group. It was not a lot. So they had to do a work of persuasion. This work happened first at the regional and national levels, with visits to experimental farms to show farmers, look, this system, it works, it's viable, you can do it. And most of all, the Pig Institute published a statistical study showing that farmers who had grouped their sows had better economic returns than farmers who were still raising sows in individual crates. And according to one of the engineers who led this study, farmers took advantage of compliance to rationalize their operations. It enabled them to improve both their technical and economic performances and their working conditions. And these results were very widely disseminated in the agricultural press. But this work of persuasion also happened at the level of producer organizations. And technical advisors used two ways to convince farmers to take the plunge. First, they emphasized the risk of non-compliance. In so doing, they became the armed wing of the commission. And it was not always a very easy work. Some farmers reacted in a very hostile manner. And for example, one hosting advisor said he had to wear a bulletproof vest to meet these farmers. The second way was to portray compliance as an economic opportunity for farmers, especially for younger farmers. Technical advisors told them, look, this is a great opportunity to reorganize your farm, to centralize your livestock facilities on a single location to make it more efficient. We encourage them to take advantage of the public subsidies introduced in 2008 to rationalize their operation at the lower cost. So, while these agricultural advisors contributed to compliance, they also refined the meaning of compliance. For them, it wasn't about abiding by law or about making paid sows more comfortable in building in big buildings. It was also about proving oneself for farmers as an efficient farmer. So to conclude, I will underscore 3 points. First of all, legal intermediation and repair feed each other. We have shown that legal intermediation helps repairing the regulatory fragility of industrial farming. But on the contrary, the work of repair feeds into legal intermediation. Agricultural advisors are credible legal intermediaries because they have detailed knowledge of the local and individual specificities of the farms. The second point, it is that we hope that by combining STS and law and society research, we hope that we can contribute to the debates about the technological lock-in that prevents the rise of alternative farming systems. The literature on the lock-in of intensive farming systems has shown that agricultural research contributes to this lock-in. Most of all because the research conducted is part of the industrial model and it allows it to maintain higher productivity than alternative models. By contrast, this presentation highlights a more complex picture. We think that agricultural advisors support the industrial model, but they are aware that defending the status quo is a lost cause. So, in the face of hostile legislation, they defend adaptations or reparations that are compatible with the dominant model. So in this way, they play a pivotal role in the perpetuation of this model and in the legitimation of this model. Last point, we can add something more about the relationship between expertise and the regulatory process, beyond the case of farming. The literature on regulatory science is focused on specialized expert committees. But here we show that more local and peripheral forms of expertise have an impact on regulatory outcomes. This leads us to highlight a certain division of labor in knowledge-based legal intermediation, essentially between the scientists working at a more general levels, for example, in the EU expert committees, and the engineers and technicians who carry out individualized advisory work with farmers. So I think we have said the essential we could say about this case. So thank you for your attention, and we hope for your we are very eager with your questions. Thank you.
Thank you both for this really interesting presentation. If you can stop sharing screen, we can. The format usually is that we take a 10-minute break and then we come back for questions and discussion. Okay, so thank you again very much. This is very stimulating. And we'll see you all back in 10 minutes. And I will also invite you to join us as panelists, our attendees, so that we can have a kind of conversation when we can see each other. So thanks again, and see you in 10. Okay, so thank you for joining us for discussion, Rebecca and Sylvia. And if you already have a question, then feel free to raise it, or if not, I can start the discussion. Shall I do it? So I really enjoyed the paper. I saw a kind of earlier another version of this at the meeting of the Society for the Social Studies of Science, and I was very intrigued by your work and impressed. So I had one question about a couple of questions. One question was about the technological lock-in that you mentioned as one of your conclusions, as a new form of technological lock-in. So I wanted to hear a little bit more about that. Like, what is new about this way of getting sort of locked in? And is it the dimension of like adapting to a legislation, or yeah, so I just wanted to hear a little bit more about that. And I guess technological lock-in is always a kind of socio-technological lock-in to begin with. So yeah, so I wanted to hear a little bit more about that. Let's start with that, if that's okay.
Sure. I guess in the initial concept of lock-in, there is this idea that the researchers who constantly improve the industrial model, make it more and more productive, they really they have this goal in mind to defend this model at all costs, that this should be the dominant model. And what we show is that the agricultural scientists who are involved with an intensive farming system which is challenged by legislation, they have to acknowledge this challenge. They cannot act like they cannot do what they want anymore. So they have to acknowledge this challenge, and they know that defending the status quo won't work. So I think this is the little twists we're adding. I don't know if Marc-Olivier, you want to add something?
Yes, just one few words. I think that thinking about lock-in in agriculture, it leads us to see what doesn't change. The idea is that there's technology systems who are very, very easy to, very difficult, sorry, to change. And in fact, it is the case. But if you look at the things more closely, you see that in fact there are constant adaptations of the system. So they change always. They always change, and they have to incorporate new things. And one of these things it is the new legal constraints on agriculture. And what we try to show it is that the perpetuation of this of major technological systems in agriculture is possible only because there are always these very, very negotiated adaptations to new regulations. And it is sure that on the whole, pigs are raised today in a very similar way as they were raised 10 years or 20 years ago. But it's not exactly the same. And this very little difference makes a difference. And it is an important point for the pig setter to obtain political support and to obtain legitimacy. For example, I made many interviews with pig farmers and with other people in the pig sector, and they all said now we are aware of pig welfare. We made many changes in our farms, but. And they are very convinced of that because for them it was sometimes a big investment and it changed some things in their work. But if you consider the changes at the scale of the farm, it is very, very limited. But they got convinced with that. So it is a so important point for them to not only at a political level to gain support from governments, but also to be convinced as themselves as being good farmers and good citizens, and to address some of the criticisms that address pig farming.
Thanks. I don't know if somebody else wants to ask a question, or Rebecca. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks for your talk, Sebastian and Marc-Olivier. So I am Rebecca Ibanez. I am in Amsterdam. I'm an anthropologist and STS scholar. I am also in a research institution. I am here tenured as a researcher. And coincidentally, I also have a project on pigs, but it's the project that a student is doing field work. So I haven't been in the field yet. So what we want to explore is this idea of like care and metabolic exchange, like metabolic lives going on in the industrial pig farming. And when I was hearing you about this repair or remediation in legal frameworks, I was really intrigued by if you could empirically specify a bit more how these agricultural advisors that you were talking about, that they are not trained legally, but they make local interpretations and craft local interventions. If you could tell me a bit more empirically, what are those normatively? What are they intervening in, or what? So yeah, what is the interventions that they normally do? You see them doing? What are the concerns? What are the legal interpretations that they are doing or remediating? If you could give me a few examples.
Should I start, Marc-Olivier, and then you
Yes.
follow up? I think the legal intermediation happens at various levels. So first of all, you have this ambitious legislative agenda launched by the EU, and so basically at that point the field is very open, and it's up to vets, scientists, maybe some engineers to produce data, scientific work to show what is necessary in order to improve the welfare of pigs. And at that point, the scientists involved with the French pig sector, they're pretty active. They do a lot of work to downplay the need for legislation, basically. And then once the 2001 directives are passed, the French government, who is in charge of implementing the directive and making sure that the farmers comply with the new regulation, the French Ministry of Agriculture is a bit clueless. They have this small unit dedicated to animal welfare, the French Ministry of Agriculture. And whenever they need technical details about the average French pig farm, they ask the agricultural advisors. When they set up a checklist for each farm, so this is how farms should be inspected, an inspection checklist. They negotiate that directly with the producer organizations and the agricultural advisors. And towards the end of the time frame, the ones who actually advise farmers on what non-compliance would mean in terms of fines, in terms of penalties, etc., and who convince farmers that it's better to comply because then you receive subsidies, etc. Those are again the agricultural advisors. So you can see at different steps like this, they intervene both in the interpretation of EU legislation, and they also a key actor in the implementation and in making sure that the farmers comply. And they don't do this they don't do this and by doing this, they actually tweak the meaning of what compliance is for farmers, because they insist a lot on how it's an opportunity to improve the efficiency of the farm, to reorganize it, to centralize different buildings into one building. And actually, in this way, they promote the model of the large, intensive pig farming through the compliance of with legislation that was supposed to challenge it in the first place. So,
just to add one thing, in France, pig farming is mainly concentrated in one region, in Brittany. Brittany is a small region in the west of France. It represents about 60% of pig farming in France. And in this region, there's also a concentration of research organizations, experimental farms, and so on. And the people working in these places, I mean, researchers, engineers, working for the French National Institute, so our own employer, people working for the chambers of agriculture, for the Pig Institute, they all live and work in the same, but most of them live and work in the same region. And they work together in many ways. they share the same they do experiments together in the same stations. They belong to some kinds of research networks. For example, there was a research network on pig housing, which was located at in an experimental farm in the west of Brittany, in the far west of Brittany. And when this new regulations on the welfare of pig came up, the first thing they did it was to discuss together, and they work in a very they work together to find ways to comply with these new regulations. So I think it is important, and what I didn't say, it is that these people they are very involved too in producers' organizations. They are members of boards. They are invited in meetings organized by the producers' organization and so on. So it is a very, I think probably it is a specificity of this sector in France, because Sebastian and I, we interviewed someone who spoke us about the bovine sector, and he told us that what was the specificity of the pig sector, it was this very strong integration of research with the economic actors of the sector. So what mattered most for these people, it was, okay, there are these new regulations. We try to at first to contain these regulations at the European level, but we did the most we did, but we could, but nevertheless, there are new norms. So what can we do? And they work in different ways. They did some new research. They did some. There are many discussions with farmers, especially with the farmers who are elected members of chambers of unions, to try to find some ways of complying. And in fact, the main way was to observe what farmers did on their own, and there were some we can say some pioneers, some farmers who, on their own way, who tried who had to make some new investments in their farms. So they had no choice; they just had to comply with the norms, and they observed what happened in these farms. And at the beginning, the main studies done on group, I was saying on sows raised in groups, was not experimental things. It was just to observe what happened in the farms where these new systems were put in place. So it is this works, these very grassroots works that led them after several years to identify the systems who were the most favored by farmers, and so it led to the story we told about the choice of supporting the systems that were the most reassuring for farmers. And well, I hope I answered your questions.
Thank
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't know if Sylvia, you have a question as well. Yes.
Yes, thank you so much for both, for a very interesting presentation about the welfare pig system. I didn't know about this. My background, I'm a nutritionist, so and I've been working mostly with obesity, and of course I'm also a collaborator of mitigation, so also sustainability is other expertise of my background. So thank you for that. I learned a lot, and maybe the questions or comments that I'll address, they don't make so much sense, so I apologize already for that. But so I would like to start by, for instance, asking what is the influence that the agricultural advisors have in creating or the legislations or the regulations? Because they advise, I guess, the politicians or the members of the parliament with the questions that are asked to provide information. The thing is, probably the members of the parliament, they also have their own narrative and understanding what should be the direction of the changes in the welfare pig system in particular. So then the agricultural advisors or the scientists that are advising will just answer the specific questions that are in the frame of what they wanted to be asked or answered. Because apparently, from what I understood, the EFS system that was from the more Scandinavia countries was the most beneficial for the welfare system. And in the end, in 2001, that was not the one that was taken. And was more the small and narrow spaces for the pigs. So somehow the legislation was far away from ideally and not meeting actually the hopes, as you both mentioned. So how much the agricultural advisors can influence, given that in the end, the role of the agricultural advisors is to interpret the law. So they have to interpret something that I don't know how much they influence even the law. And also afterwards, they have to implement the law by domesticating, and I'm using now your words, the farms or the farmers. Sorry for my voice, I'm a bit sick. So it seems a bit impossible work. If we are, of course, following the narrative, we are just going in that way. So it's kind of, as you're saying, feeding the system. We don't have space for the alternative because we are creating just one way, and we wanted to have the expertise to feed that system. So we are even getting the credit. So this narrative is being supported by experts in a narrative that is just that narrative. So it feels a bit, absurd. I mean, not absurd, actually it's quite makes sense, but it's just to create a new illusion. And also how much is the participation of the farmers, as a stakeholder as well, how much the farmers, and now, of course, I'm not talking about the big industry, I'm talking about the farmers. How much is the participation also of them in order to be more inclusive in these legislations? And again, thank you for your presentation.
So just give a couple of elements. Thank you for those comments. I mean, they really helped giving some perspective. On the farmers, it's something I didn't say, but I should have said during the presentation when I presented the different actors, the different types of agricultural advisors that were involved in the process. I should have added that, and this is something that Marc-Olivier said in his previous answer. These agricultural advisors, they're very well connected with each other, but they're also very well connected with the political leaders of the pig sector. So the different producer organizations, they are members of an umbrella organization representing their interests. And during the 1990s, before the 2001 directives were passed, there was a special lobbyist appointed by this umbrella organization to lobby in Brussels on behalf of the entire French pig sector. So there was really close integration between the political interests representing both the farmers and the pig industry as a whole, and the agricultural advisors. Yeah.
Yes, just at one point, it is true that we didn't work specifically on the work in the European Parliament. It is, I would say, it is a blind spot of this research. So we worked mainly on the way the regulations were interpreted and implemented in France, but the very way that some MPs worked on this subject, it is something we didn't study in this case. But the main point it is that the main French lobbyist of the pig sector who was in charge with the animal welfare issue at the time when the directive was drafted. This man said himself, and he said in different settings, he said that the directive was not very a threat for farmers. So he was very happy with himself and what he did at the European level to work on the directive and to reduce the ambition of the directive to a very small part of animals raised in pig farms. But how the negotiations happened?
Sorry,
we don't have data on this point.
Sorry to interrupt. I just had a kind of also follow-up question, because I was wondering about sort of like reading a little bit between the lines here, or thinking about this process of domesticating, you know, is this domestication or some sort of how much of it is so domesticating a law that you see come up as potentially hostile, right? Or this kind of wild wild European legislation that you have to make friendly to your setting, right, to your environment and your practices, and domesticate it that way, or is it another kind of process where you're in a way like, at the same time amputating, or at the same time in this domestication, like violating or mutilating, or how much of this process is perhaps something that you can critique as inappropriate, as unfair, or, you know, going back to the aims of this legislation in protecting animal welfare, right? So it's interesting also, going back to Rebecca's interest in care, to notice that here there seems to be very little care for the animal, in that sense of, you know, the animal as a being that the farmer has the responsibility to care for. And so that's another question of like, would you say that I'm not sure who your informants were and whether they included the farmers here, but were their motives unaffected by concerns for welfare, given that so few farms adapted to a more sort of the EFS system, or was there? How does animal care from the farmers come in, or from other agents come into this process, and why do you think it doesn't come in? So another question is like, should there be another intermediary, or other types of actors in this process? Can you imagine what could be different so that these legislations don't get domesticated that way, or keep some of their initial, shall we say, punch or power? So I was maybe it's a very long and rambling kind of comment / question, but like, I'm thinking about, okay, repairing this repair process, if that's at all possible. And if you could imagine, like, or help us imagine how that might happen. You know, I'm the philosopher, right? So I will ask these questions where, you know, you have to speculate.
I'm just
possibly.
I'm just going to mention a couple of things that surprised me when we went through the research material, the interviews, etc. And one thing that surprised me in the early 2000s was what we read in the archive of the French Ministry of Agriculture. So these were the meetings that were held in France to figure out how France would transpose EU legislation in French legislation, and what they're going to put in the French regulation to implement this. And the French ministry, the officials, they hold meetings and they invite animal rights activists. They invite organizations promoting animal welfare, and these organizations, they're clueless. They have no idea of what's going on in Brussels. They have no idea of what the stakes are. So I mean, I was really surprised by this. So that's one thing. So civil society organizations interested in these issues should identify the key points where these standards and these regulations are made. And another issue is the lack of expertise, the lack of expertise in the French state. They really depended on these actors we described. Whenever they had to make a decision, they had no choice but to rely to set up a committee where people from the Chambers of Agriculture sat, people from INRA, and they just didn't have the resources to answer those questions themselves.
Yes, just perhaps to add some additional comments. If you read the directives on pig welfare, they contain many recommendations to improve the welfare of pigs, and if you read them, you could think, oh, it is if all these things were done in farm on pig farms, it would represent many changes. And as a matter of fact, when the French services of the Ministry of Agriculture had to apply these new regulations, they made a choice to focus on a few points and not to consider the whole all the norms. And the main point was sows in groups. But there are many other points in the directives. For example, about the light in the buildings, about the fact of giving water at any moment for pigs if they needed it, about even about the objects, all the stuff you give to pigs to manipulate. I mean, and for example, in standard pig farms, pigs are just put in little in plant spaces, and they don't have anything to play except the other animals, and the consequence is of many pathologies among pigs. And there was a norm which said that farmers had to put some things inside the pig farms for pigs. Sometimes some farmers used metal chains or pieces of wood, these kinds of things. But the real thing to do and there was some experts for example, at the French National Agency for Health and Food. They consider that the real thing to do is to add straw in the bedding. So you have to cover the floor with straw. Straw is a better material for pigs for many things. But in fact, when the French administration had to enact this regulation, these norms, so they put the priority on certain norms, and so within groups, and the other norms they put them, they control them later. And one important thing it is that there are very few people to control the farms. Even if the sector is much more consolidated before than it was 20 years ago or 30 years ago, there are still thousands of farms in France, of pig farms, and the controls are very weak. You don't control a farm every year, for example. So and the administration considers also the economic fragility of farms. So they are very they give themselves priorities. But for example, I would say that the regulations in the environment field are much more controlled than the regulations in pig welfare, for example, because the impact is on animals, but not on the people who live outside the farm. And for example,
aware of the time. Sorry to interrupt you, Marc-Olivier, but we have run out of time, so I don't want to keep people too long. But yeah, I don't know if we have any. If you have other comments or if we have any final questions. I mean, I interrupted you there with a selection of the norms, and I still didn't hear from either of you what you think could be improved, but I hear you say that perhaps, you know, this kind of possibility to choose or how to flag these like elements of a directive and how much leeway, I guess, to allow could be something that can change, I guess, from another level at the EU, perhaps. But yeah, I wonder about, you know, this different. It's very nice to hear from Sebastian also this comments on the lack of expertise, and maybe in the public sector and in civil society, and maybe supplementing that expertise. And I guess I have many more questions, but shall I ask one more question? Anyone else want to jump in? Yeah, okay.
Thank you so much for this. I hope that we will be in touch. Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you too. Thank you.
Yes. And one last question I had was about the payment of these advisors and how they're getting making a salary of the agricultural advisor. Would you, as a farmer, hire an agricultural advisor, or would yeah, so how is it sort of financially organized, this role or profession?
Okay, but they are not paid on a service base. There are different cases. The scientists, the engineers of the chambers of agriculture are just paid as by their employers, so they don't receive other payments from the farmers. And the technical advisors who are working for producer organizations, the advice on the changes of on the translation of new norms in the farm at the level of the farm, it is just a part of the basic service of the producer organization for farmers. So farmers are members of producer organizations. They pay for this. They have a fee for every year. For example, sometimes it is just a fee per pig. They pay a few cents per pig, so they can benefit from all the services of the organization. So the advisors are not paid by farmers for every advice. They just can benefit from special fees if, for example, they have to make some plans for new buildings or to you have more work, so we have some special fees for the kind of work. But then not always an economic relationship between the advisor and the farmer, but the advisors consider that as the service of farmers, so they will try to find with them what is the best solution for the farmer. This is also the best solution for the producer organization, because this organization needs farmers who are economically solid. If the farmers suffer too much from the new regulations, the producer organization will suffer too. So they are completely adjusted to the needs of the farmers.
Interesting.
And many of these technical advisors are issued from the farmers milieu. Some of them are sons of farmers, or they are from farmers and from families. So it is a very, very close relationship with the farming world.
Thank you very much, both of you, for this contribution. And I hope you'll join us for other webinars in this series, and we get to talk with you more. Thanks again, and see you for our next meeting. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.